Welcome back, everybody. I've been a George Carlin fan since seeing him perform back in college. The next day, I bought the AM/FM album, and I've been a fan ever since. Intelligence in humor is rare. And George Carlin was the first to present it to the rock culture, a culture that George continues to serve as the kids of the Woodstock age, and the new kids come on board. And unlike so many of the hippies of that time, George Carlin continues to be counterculture. He hasn't sold out. He hasn't become mainstream. George Carlin's new book is called Napalm and Silly Putty, and it's the really addicting follow-up to the 97 book called Brain Droppings. George, it's great to have you on the show, man.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind words, too.
How did we get so conservative, George?
Well, we have to generalize to talk about it a bit, and I know you're okay with that. It seems like there was an awful lot. Well, it goes without saying, there was an awful lot of self-indulgence in that generation and that whole movement. Not just the drugs and the sex and those things, which are fine because they go with being young anyway. But not that love is exclusive to the young. But those things are more of an experimental area when you're younger. But the self-indulgence of the individuals, that everybody was celebrating at that time, they're still very self-indulgent. These boomers. I mean, that's still their core value, is taking care of themselves. I don't care much for them, and we're talking about an age cohort here, so it's a little unfair to the people that aren't prosperous, because boomers seem all to be semi-prosperous.
Yeah.
There are a lot of poor people in that age group that don't represent boomers at all. But for those people, those terrible boomers, those insipid people, they're still celebrating themselves, and they're still trying to make life easy for themselves, and they create these categories for themselves. Here's an example, a small example with a large implication. They don't want to be old. They don't want to get old, and they don't want to die, and they're afraid of the word old. And you know what they call the ones who are now, like, I think it's between 55 and 75, they call themselves pre-elderly.
Yeah.
That's the kind of way they protect themselves. Yeah. And they're really appallingly repulsive people.
Yeah, very good point. And the conservative nature of the country, sometimes I go to these talk radio conventions sometimes, George, and I see all these Rush Limbaugh wannabes.
Yeah.
And I don't understand how it took hold in a culture of where this massive rock and roll youth became of age. How did this happen?
Well, I think it's a phenomenon of being young, that you buck the system that your parents created. And that's true of every generation, and it should be. There's plenty to complain about and rail against, but then the real world begins to stare at them, and most of them can't afford, for some reason or other, and I don't mean in a financial way, they can't afford to really live outside the system in some manner and have some kind of life that they want. So the system co-opts them, and their values change. They start to get interested in their salary and their job qualifications and the right marriage, because the business community insists on the right marriage, the right number of children, the golf club membership, and all those things. But this country has always been, to me, a conservative, semi-fascist country. The only reason we fought Germany was because they wanted to take over the world, and that was our job. That was our job, to take over the world and to exercise hegemony. We say that we do it in a peaceful way, but we are destroying other cultures with our own consumer culture in a very subtle manner, and co-opting them and taking them over and exploiting them in the way that used to be done militarily.
Yeah. Oh, so much of that is true. So much of that I agree with.
And I love young spirit and young people's rebellion, because that I have tried to keep that alive in myself. There's very little in this country that people are supposed to value, the values that are handed to you, that I agree with, and I try to question them whenever I can. And I think people should always question what's told to them by parents, by teachers, by the culture, whatever it is.
That's what I had an English teacher that said that. In fact, he got so upset one time, George, in high school, he threw the book down because we were taking notes just the way he told us, and his interpretation of Moby Dick. And he said, you didn't question me. You accepted it. And, teachers don't do that today.
No.
They told us to question and not accept it.
Right.
And I just think that's
also true of that Barbara Bush. I've made a point that, first of all, this president is obviously an imbecile, and what's interesting is her big thing. The First Lady is always told to go get some charitable thing you can be interested in, so we can tell everyone what you're interested in. And hers was reading children reading more. Mm-hmm. And she shouldn't so much be telling children to read as you should be telling them to question what they read. Look at what you read and be critical of it, and think and ask questions. But that wouldn't occur to those kind of people, and because it's not in their interest.
No, that's exactly right. To question and not believe everything you hear. Right. It's something that is getting
even
lost.
From your parents. I mean, it's
right.
proper to say, well, aren't you saying that in a way, Dad, with your self-interest in mind? Aren't you trying to maintain a certain something here by telling me that, even if you're wrong, at least you open up discussion.
Yeah, it's like you said, and I don't know, I sometimes confuse your writing and all the HBO specials. You were talking about how fundamentalists, whether they're Jewish, the Christian, doesn't matter. All over the world, they're making life very interesting. And as far as questioning, that is out of their question. They don't want people to question.
No, what's interesting is about religion and the belief in God is that if you look at, and the last HBO show I talked about the whether or not prayer had any value. Mm-hmm. To me, you can pray to Joe Pesci and you can get the same percentage of answered prayers as you will from the so-called God. 50% of the time you'll get what you want, 50% you won't. And then these people who believe in God, when they don't get their prayers answered, their answer is, well, it was God's will. He didn't want me to have that. And then my question is, well, why pray in the first place if he's going to do what he wants? Why not just accept God's will and go about your business? And all this praying makes no sense. And what I was going to say is there's about as much proof for the existence of a God as there is for UFOs. And yet, if you talk about believing in UFOs, you are marginalized in this society. You're made to seem ridiculous and a fool and a kook and a conspiracy buff and all. They marginalize you.
Right.
But if you don't mention God in the proper reverent tone, you're in big trouble. There's a very special place for certain imaginary creatures and a very other kind of place for so-called unidentified, the extraterrestrials or whoever might be interested in us.
It's very interesting how they and I don't want to get into a whole discussion on this, but a lot of times when you will question a fundamentalist about their belief and compare it to UFOs in some sense, they said the spirit, the word of God is not something you can interpret. The word of God is, and they just have such a mindset, you can't win an argument. So
no, because what they're saying is that the human mind shouldn't be used. They'll tell you that God gave us all of our faculties, and that God, of course, gave us our brain and our mind. But when you use the brain to question God, they say, no, you don't question God. You just believe it. You just accept it. So, in other words, don't use that brain for all of the things it can do, just the ones we say.
Yeah, that's so true. George Carlin is our special guest, someone I've wanted to have on this show for many years. A lot of your friends we've had on. And speaking of friends, the Jerky Boys are regular on this show. A big part of Laugh.com. One of the coolest websites to come along this year, and one that we're going to put a big link on my page to, is Laugh.com. This is your baby.
Well, I am one of the founding comedians. There is a partnership, and I have a very minority position in the company. So, but I got with it because it seems as though a good, solid comedy destination on the internet is a good idea for comedians and comedy, of and by comedians for comedy, and this site will build and grow. It's just at the early stages, and it's the topic, the subject matter of comedy and the comedy itself. It's such a vast thing that it takes some time to be as complete as I think it should be, but it is doing very well in that respect right now. You mentioned the Jerky Boys. The thing about this website that's different is that it's not just a website. It's also a record label. It is a record company called Laugh.com that makes CDs of its own. The Jerky Boys just have made one most recently. It's doing very well. as you know, they've been hugely successful before this time, and I would expect it would continue with this. But now we have an arrangement where we're in stores, too. So Laugh.com has a label with guys like the Jerky Boys, and Jonathan Winters recorded his first CD, his first album in 30 years, and I'm not able to. I'm under contract to Atlantic Records. They're my distribution. It's my own company, Eardrum, but I'm not in a position to make one for them, but I'm thinking of a way to do that myself in the next couple of years that would not make Atlantic mad at me, and that would still put me on Laugh.com. There are a lot of comics doing it, and I think there are over 40 CDs now that we have.
Yeah, it is incredible, and it's one of the best things that happened to comedy as far as I'm concerned. I love it. Talking about the book, Napalm and Silly Putty, there's so many funny things. And it's actually one of those books you just can't put down. You walk from room to room. You walk from the kitchen. If you want to sit down at dining room, you take it with, hell, I just had it in the bathroom.
Don't forget the bathroom.
Right. So some of the things that stick out, the dogs and cats. That's great. Do you have dogs and cats? And talk about that a little bit.
Well, the dogs and cat stuff that's in the book is over the years on the HBO shows and in my albums, I did several generations of material on dogs and cats, particularly dogs. And I took the best of those things and tried to fashion them for the page. You know, performing verbally and appealing to a person's ear is one thing. Writing for the page and getting into their brain through the eye is another. So these things, everything that I did like that took some careful revising and editing for the eye. But I think I was very successful at it, and these things have translated well to the page. But you know, the nice thing about a topic like that, and I have three areas I draw from. I'll get back to the question.
No, sure.
The three areas I've always drawn from for my comedy, and one of the reasons I think that I've lasted is, first of all, the big world of the things we were talking about: values, boomers, consumerism, religion, God, hate, love, death, war, those things, the big issue things. I've always used some of that. Then there's language, talking about how we speak to one another and the way we use words. That's been a big important part of my delivery. And then the third thing were these little things, the small world, dogs and cats, driving, what's in the refrigerator, your stuff. The things that all of us experience every day.
Like eating a whole bag of cookies.
Yeah.
Nonstop. I've done that. And I've looked at the toaster. And I've looked at the toaster.
Yeah, that's good. You have to. Look at the toaster and eat the cookies and stand there knowing something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is.
And you was talking about racism. You know, you don't want to say colored people, but you can say people of color.
Yeah, and the ones who are saying people of color are these people who are trying to show how good they are. These white elitists who are really saying, we know best what's good for the black man. We know what to call you. We know what name you should have. Same with the Indians. They want to call them Native Americans. Well, they're not. They came from Asia. They're not natives. And then we gave them the awful word Americans to have to live under that burden as well. You went from cookies to racism kind of quickly. Maybe you were thinking of Oreos.
No, I just was thinking of all the things that made me laugh out loud.
Thank you. I'm real proud of the book, and I'm proud of my range. You know?
Yeah, the range from Walnut Street and Chestnut Street. Every city has one. You've never seen a Peanut Street.
Never that. And never Mixed Nuts Street or Honey Roasted Mixed Nuts. Ever. No avenue like that. No Cashew Boulevard. They don't have cashews. Filbert nuts there.
No.
All the other ones.
Napalm and Silly Putty. We're going to take a break and back with George Carlin.